People often ask me questions about transit and whether it has a strong future ahead. Maybe because of COVID and working from home and 10,000 other different things. And truth be told, I am slightly biased, with all of this. But I think transit has an incredibly strong future, and I'm going to tell you all about it. If you're new here, I make videos about transit, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss a single one. As much as I like to talk about great transit systems and expansions around the world, there are legitimate challenges transit faces and people want to talk about them. Now, depending on where you live, it can be hard to appreciate these. If you live in Seoul or Berlin, you live in a city that does have a fair number of cars, but that also has a great transit system. And so you probably can't really imagine a perspective on a world where transit just doesn't exist at all. Even if you live in North America, in a place like Toronto or Seattle or Los Angeles or maybe even New York, you probably feel that transit is really important because it already plays a part of your daily lives, or at least the daily lives of people you know, or because your city is spending a ton of money to build a lot more of it in a visible way. And you wouldn't be committed to something so significant if it wasn't the future, right? But not everyone has this experience, so it's important, even as transit supportive people, that we consider this. I think probably the biggest issue that transit pertains to, at least in the modern world, is environmental protection, notably pollution and CO2 emissions from cars. To be totally clear, sprawl is bad and has a lot of bad environmental impacts, but the impacts are often less directly seen than with something like CO2 emissions. And that leads us into our first potential transit killer, electric vehicles. Now, unlike a lot of people in the transit space, I'm really positive on electric vehicles. I think if we were to take the world we have today and replace all of the current vehicles with electric vehicles, we'd be in a clearly much better world. And I don't think that really needs to be controversial. Air pollution is a massive problem, especially in major cities, transit or not. So even if you're doing the right thing by riding transit, you still probably suffer from air pollution. I remember traveling to Tokyo, a city really renowned for its fantastic transit, and still having really poor air quality for my entire time there. Now, of course, could the world be much better than a world where we simply remove cars and replace them with electric cars? Of course. But electric cars still play a valuable role in making cars less bad, which is a valuable thing. That said, obviously electric cars don't obviate the need for transit, since, as I've already mentioned, they're just electric cars. They have most of the same issues that regular cars have, they just don't have tailpipe emissions. Now, another big issue that we have is COVID, and this is a tense one, I get it. Most people have not enjoyed the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that said, I think it's fair to say there's some cognitive bias here. The reality is that for most of the last 120 years when major rapid transit has existed around the world, COVID wasn't a problem, and there have been other major pandemics that have gone around the world. So clearly COVID doesn't really have any impact on whether we need or don't need transit. And I also think it's worth pointing out that some of the places with the worst COVID outbreaks have been fairly car-centric, and some of the places with the best management of COVID have had really good public transportation. One of the other issues I frequently see and people ask me about, and is a really hard question, is public support. What do we do if there's no public support for transit? I think public support is something that's definitely easy to understand how people could see it as a barrier. But the reality is that it's usually only a major issue in places that don't already have pretty good transit. In cities and even countries where transit is a pretty big deal, even traditionally conservative politicians tend to support some degree of public transit. And I think a lot of the factors that I think will push transit to be even more important in the future will apply even more so to places that don't have good transit today. The last major issue that I've heard, and one that might sound a little odd, but it's perhaps understandable, is wealth. Some people have asked me before if, with the world becoming more and more affluent, if much of the world just doesn't need public transit because everyone could ostensibly afford to just buy a car. I think this critique or concern falls apart the most quickly of all of the major ones, but here's why. First of all, a lot of wealthy places around the world still have great public transit. Switzerland, for example. And often in these places, public transit actually gets more investment because it's seen as something that really helps the nation. At the same time, I'd argue a lack of strong public transit often correlates more with lower wealth than with higher wealth. And as countries and cities develop, building significant public transportation is usually one of the things that they do. I also think this is one of those problems that falls along the sort of continuum of what if we just had unlimited money and everyone could buy a car and drive it to their heart's content? Sort of like, what if we had unlimited space or unlimited resources? The reality is, resources are not infinite, and the cost of, say, a bus or a train is much less than the cost of the number of cars that would be required to replace it, not to mention the infrastructure. Now, often people critique public transit for not being profitable, but the reality is that our whole road networks ever profitable? Suffice to say, a lot of questions are often asked of public transit from people who don't get to experience good public transit on a regular basis. And it's easy to do when you don't see public transit being a central part of the public realm. But I think there are a number of fundamental forces in the world that are going to make transit even more important in the future. So let's talk about them. The first is the biggest issue I see at present in the world: climate change and environmental damage. I think climate change is one of those issues, like many issues we've faced, where we don't really see the issue coming and then it just happens all at once. You can kind of feel this because we've been talking about climate change for a long time, and now we're starting to see the impacts of it, like yearly wildfires that cover cities that used to have really good air in summer, like my hometown of Vancouver, BC, with a yearly cloud of really unpleasant wildfire smoke, or with floods in places that previously didn't really suffer from much flooding. I think as climate change becomes a more and more acutely visible problem, the pressure to invest in sustainable infrastructure will only grow. And the reality of sprawling, space-intensive car infrastructure is that it's a lot harder to harden against some of these environmental issues. For example, you can put transportation infrastructure underground to protect it from problems on the surface, but it's obviously much harder to put the same amount of capacity underground with roads as it is with public transit. Another major issue is health considerations, and this kind of alludes to one of the problems I mentioned before, but taking a different angle. As the world has become more and more digitally connected, people have started to live more and more sedentary lifestyles. And that is something that certainly isn't helped by having a car that you can walk downstairs or into another room of your house and get into and drive wherever you want. With public transit, some degree of activity is built into your day-to-day life, and I think this health aspect is really huge to making our cities and societies healthier. At the same time, I actually think digital technology, while many will discuss it in terms of things like self-driving cars or automated vehicles, is actually something that creates a lot of benefits for transit. In the past, if you were to drive to work versus get on a bus, there was less of a case for getting on the bus when you didn't have a smartphone. But now that everyone can watch TV or go on the internet or even do work while they're sitting on a transit vehicle, the case for driving has gotten a lot weaker. At the same time, the technologies that benefit car travel, like automated vehicles, will also benefit public transit by allowing things like automated buses and rail. Of course, something a lot of places, especially car-dependent places, have experienced over the years is increased cost of living. Now, obviously, we need to address cost of living issues, like housing here in Toronto, directly. But if you take a broad-based approach and look at a lot of different countries, cost of living issues aren't just extreme and in a few locations. They're really broad and they exist all around the world. Of course, to different extents though. That said, when someone's on a limited income, do they really want to buy an expensive car that they're going to leave parked most likely most of the day, every day? Not to mention if that car gets even more expensive because now it's electric. For me personally, compared to times in my life when I've owned a car, I save at least $500 every single month by not having a car. And that's a really big difference for the average person. Of course, this sort of ties in directly with the idea of a sharing economy, which is a bit controversial, but I think for mobility, it's really an important concept to talk about. What I think a lot of people who support the idea of automated cars and the like don't seem to realize is that that will mean that owning a car makes less and less and less sense. Especially as the cost of an individual car with all of these sensors and computing capabilities as well as batteries required to make autonomous cars practical. What this inevitably leads to is cars being something that you get on demand through some sort of ride-sharing service. And if that's the case and you don't own a car, you have a lot less reason to use one whenever it's unnecessary, like going to the grocery store. I think if the average person could choose to just walk to a grocery store that's in their local area versus getting in a car and driving to one, they're probably going to choose to walk. And of course, some people won't. But the idea is that the majority of people probably don't see any need to get into a car if it's not explicitly necessary. Especially when cars have been rendered a completely generic commodity that you don't actually drive and that you basically just sit on, like a bus. At the same time, people are becoming more and more aware of the impacts of our incredibly car-dependent and frankly bland cities we've built in much of the world. I'd like to say YouTubers like City Beautiful, Not Just Bikes, Alan Fisher, and perhaps even myself have helped contribute to this. Younger generations see less and less benefit in living in sprawling, low-density housing in the middle of what was traditionally natural environment. And at the same time, the cost of living and unsustainable nature of such development is meaning it's not even practical anymore. If you go to any major city, even in North America, a place which isn't traditionally transit supportive, you'll see mixed-use development everywhere, where people get to live closer to the things they do and the places they work. And this is because there is a fundamental problem with our cities in that they're inconvenient to access when you need to drive everywhere to do anything. The issue with a lot of the critiques about making transit obsolete or unnecessary is that they face the same problems that transit advocacy sometimes faces. It sees transit as a single-purpose tool, whether an affordable way of getting around or the environmentally sustainable way of getting around, instead of a cohesive mobility option that provides a ton of different benefits that can't be replicated with other modes. So yeah, I'm incredibly positive about transit being here for the long haul, and I think it's only going to become more important in the future. Thanks for watching.